They say television is all smoke and mirrors. But what if one of its most iconic shows tried to bury a moment so explosive it nearly tore the whole thing apart? For decades, Soul Train was more than just a dance show. It was a movement, a celebration, a symbol of pride. But behind the glittering lights and smooth grooves, there was a moment so intense, producers swore it would never see the light of day. A moment that some say triggered the downfall of a cultural empire. Whispers about what really happened on that stage have lingered for years. A clash, a confrontation, maybe even something darker. The cameras were rolling, but what happened next never aired. Not even once. So what was the scandal Soul Train tried to hide? Why did the show's ratings crash after being a Saturday staple in millions of homes? And how did the man who built it, Don Cornelius, lose control of the very legacy he fought so hard to protect? What you're about to hear isn't just a story about a TV show. It's a story about power, culture, betrayal, and a truth that was too much for prime time. Let's take a ride on the Soul Train, but this time, we're going off the tracks. Before Soul Train became a nationwide phenomenon, it was just an idea, born in the heart of Chicago, where grit, soul, and rhythm poured out of every block. In the late 1960s, America was in turmoil. The civil rights movement had shaken the nation, and black voices were fighting for space in a world that often tried to silence them. But in a small corner of local television, something powerful was beginning to take shape. Don Cornelius, a former Chicago police officer turned radio DJ, wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud, but he had vision. He saw the power of black culture, and more importantly, he believed it deserved a spotlight. At a time when black performers were often relegated to the sidelines of white-owned shows, Cornelius created something for his people, by his people. He started organizing live music events at high schools, calling them the Soul Train. Crowds came in droves, and the energy was undeniable. Then came the chance. A local TV station, WCIU, gave him a shot. On August 17, 1970, Soul Train aired its first episode in black and white. There was no budget, no major studio backing, just raw energy and a dream. The first guests? Jerry Butler, The Emotions, and the Chai Lights, names that would help define the sound of a generation. But even with its humble beginnings, the show had something electric. You could feel it in the music, in the crowd, in the moves. And at the center of it all was Don, cool, calm, commanding. With each broadcast, he wasn't just entertaining viewers, he was reshaping culture. And this was just the beginning. Success in Chicago was only the first stop. Don Cornelius knew that Soul Train had something America had never seen before. And he wasn't about to keep it local. But expanding a black-led show nationally in the early 70s? That wasn't just bold, it was borderline revolutionary. To make it happen, Cornelius needed help, and he found it in an unlikely partner, Johnson Products Company, best known for Afro Sheen. They didn't just sponsor Soul Train, they believed in it. That partnership was more than a business deal. It was a cultural alliance that gave Cornelius the boost he needed to take the show to a national stage. At first, only 7 cities agreed to air it, places like Atlanta, Detroit, and Los Angeles. But those 7 were just the spark. Within a year, the show was syndicated in 25 markets. The groove had gone coast to coast. And once it hit LA, everything changed. The stage got bigger. The guests got bolder, and the audience? They couldn't get enough. The Saturday morning ritual had begun. Turn on the TV, see people who looked like you, danced like you, dressed like you, and they weren't playing background roles. They were front and center. For millions of black families across America, Soul Train wasn't just a show, it was validation, a weekly affirmation that their music, their fashion, their culture mattered. It was no longer just entertainment. It was empowerment, wrapped in velvet suits, platform shoes, and a beat you couldn't ignore. And for Don Cornelius, it was proof that his vision wasn't too ambitious. It was overdue. If Soul Train was the vessel, Don Cornelius was the engine. The quiet force that drove it forward with unmatched vision, poise, and control. He wasn't a flashy showman. He didn't crack jokes or dance with the crowd. But when Don Cornelius spoke, people listened. That deep baritone voice, smooth as silk, became as iconic as the show's theme song. With just a glance and a nod, he commanded the stage. He didn't have to yell to lead. He embodied cool. But Don wasn't just the host. He was the architect, the executive, the strategist. In an era when black entertainers were often the talent but never the owner, Cornelius did the unthinkable. He kept control. He didn't just appear on the screen, he owned the screen, literally. By 1971, Cornelius had negotiated the syndication of Soul Train, making him one of the first black men in television history to own and produce a nationally distributed show. That alone was groundbreaking. But Don didn't stop there. He understood the power of image. He crafted a brand built on elegance, precision, and excellence. The suits were tailored. The lighting was perfect. The dancers, even if unscripted, had a kind of rhythm that made chaos look choreographed. And it was all by design. Behind the scenes, Cornelius was a perfectionist. He expected professionalism, even from unpaid dancers, and he wasn't afraid to push people hard to get it. Performers were sometimes told to redo lip syncs. Dancers were rotated based on camera readiness, and every single episode was treated like a broadcasted event, not just a dance party. He was also a savvy businessman. Cornelius formed Don Cornelius Productions, maintaining rights over his show. A power move in an industry that thrived on taking ownership away from creators, especially black creators. He didn't just make a show, he made a blueprint. But Cornelius wasn't just thinking about business. He was thinking about legacy. He saw Soul Train as more than a career. It was a mission, a platform that showed the world black joy, black talent, black excellence, without filters or apologies. For viewers at home, Cornelius wasn't just a host. He was a symbol, a dignified, intelligent, composed black man running his own empire in a world where that was still a radical idea. He closed every show with the same simple words: love, peace, and soul. It wasn't just a sign-off. It was a promise that no matter what chaos swirled outside, this was a place of culture, rhythm, unity, and pride. But the same qualities that made Don Cornelius a trailblazer, his control, his discipline, his perfectionism, would later become double-edged swords. Because when things started to change, Don wasn't ready to let go, and he wasn't ready to share the train tracks with anyone else. The music brought people in, but the dancers? They kept them watching. Soul Train wasn't just a show, it was a cultural classroom. Every Saturday, living rooms across America turned into dance studios, and millions of viewers became students. They watched closely, took mental notes, and practiced the moves at school dances, block parties, and weddings. The Soul Train line, where dancers strutted one by one between two rows, wasn't just choreography. It was a rite of passage. But what made these dancers so special wasn't training or polish. Most weren't professionals. They weren't recruited from dance academies or cast through agents. They were kids, teens, and 20-somethings from the neighborhoods of LA, Chicago, and beyond. They brought their own style, their own rhythm, and their own attitude. No scripts, no rehearsals, just raw, unfiltered energy. And that's what made it magic. You didn't just watch them, you rooted for them. You picked favorites. You waited for that one dancer to make their way down the line, wondering what move they'd hit this week. Cheryl's song became iconic, not for any studio training, but because her long, flowing hair nearly swept the floor as she danced. Every move she made felt effortless. Audiences were mesmerized. Rosie Perez, yes, that Rosie Perez, was another standout. Long before she became a Hollywood actress, she was turning heads on Soul Train. Her moves were sharp, creative, and different. She didn't just follow the beat, she hit it. She made it hers, and she wasn't alone. Dancers like Monique Mo Chambers, Randy Thomas, and Jeffrey Daniel of Shalimar all left their imprint. The show gave them not just airtime, but a sense of purpose. For many, it was the first time someone looked at them and said, "You belong on stage." Don Cornelius, ever the talent scout, understood their impact. He gave dancers the freedom to express themselves, but he also knew how much control he wanted to keep. That tightrope walk between celebration and curation would become a defining tension in the years ahead. Still, in its prime, the dancer-performer dynamic was electric. Because Soul Train wasn't just a dance show, it was a launch pad. Artists who graced the stage were some of the biggest names in music history. James Brown, Aretha Franklin, the Jackson 5, Marvin Gaye, Al Green. They didn't just perform, they belonged there. Unlike other shows that offered black artists limited space or forced them to water down their presence, Soul Train embraced them, celebrated them, and gave them the room to breathe. And what made it even more powerful was the chemistry. The performers fed off the dancers' energy, and vice versa. It was a feedback loop of rhythm. When the Jackson 5 performed their iconic robot routine in 1973, what most fans didn't know is that they learned it from the Soul Train dancers themselves. That's how influential those kids were. Marvin Gaye once sat down during his set and talked casually to the audience, like they were old friends from around the block. Al Green's voice, so soulful and haunting, could make the entire room, dancers, crew, audience, pause in awe. And through it all, Cornelius was there, the ever-steady captain of the ship. He knew the dancers were more than filler between songs. They were the heartbeat. They made Soul Train feel alive. But as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the shadows behind it. The dancers may have brought joy to millions, but what they experienced behind the scenes wasn't always as glamorous. Many were unpaid, offered little more than exposure and a box of fried chicken for their time. Some were pushed to fight for camera time, standing for hours under hot lights just for a few seconds of air. There were even whispers, stories some dared to share years later, that Cornelius didn't always treat his dancers as equals. Allegations of favoritism, tension, and worse would eventually crack the show's shiny surface. But in the early days, the dancers didn't care. They were on TV. They were seen. And for a generation hungry to feel represented, that meant everything. Because on Soul Train, you didn't need a record deal to be a star. You just needed a beat and a reason to move. For the millions watching Soul Train from their living rooms, the show was pure joy, polished, bright, and full of energy. But behind the lights, music, and effortless moves, something else was simmering. And over time, it would boil over. The tension wasn't just creative, it was personal. Don Cornelius ran a tight ship. He believed in discipline, in image, in control. That's part of what made Soul Train so consistent for so long. But it also made it rigid. And that rigidity started to clash with the free, expressive spirit of the very people who made the show great: the dancers. Rosie Perez, one of the show's standout dancers, would later break her silence in an explosive interview. She claimed that Cornelius pushed her to dance in a way she didn't feel comfortable with. Overly suggestive, in her words. When she refused, things escalated. She described a confrontation that turned physical. Feeling humiliated and angry, she threw the only thing she had on hand: a greasy, two-piece fried chicken meal the show had given her as payment. The drumsticks smacked Cornelius in the head. "I was mortified," she later recalled. But the story didn't end there. Nelson George, author and Soul Train historian, revealed there was more behind that clash. Cornelius had wanted Rosie to join a girl group he was forming. She turned him down. The rejection caused a rift, one that never healed. Rosie wasn't alone. Other dancers began speaking up. Their stories shared a common thread: low pay, long hours, high expectations, and little recognition. Some said they were never paid at all. Others recalled getting just a meal, and not always a good one, in exchange for their time, sweat, and creativity. Cheryl Song, with her signature long hair, became a fan favorite. But she too was just a teenager at the time, thrust into a high-pressure environment without guidance or protection. Many of the dancers were barely out of high school, and yet they were competing for camera time, being judged on their moves, clothes, even body types. It wasn't just exhausting, it was cutthroat. The atmosphere backstage could be tense. Dancers often competed fiercely for the front spots on the risers or prime spots in the Soul Train line. A better spot meant more screen time and more chances to be discovered. But it also meant stepping on toes, dealing with cliques, and sometimes pushing yourself harder than you should. And then there were the rumors no one wanted to talk about. Multiple sources, including a report in the Los Angeles Times, suggested that Cornelius may have had inappropriate relationships with some dancers. Though never proven in court, the accusations added fuel to an already growing fire. Dancers who once felt like family started to speak of discomfort. Power dynamics blurred. Trust broke down. Some of the very people who made Soul Train unforgettable felt used, forgotten, exposed. It was a painful contradiction. The show that made millions feel proud was making some of its own stars feel disposable. Cornelius, for his part, remained tight-lipped about most of the accusations. He stood by his record, his professionalism, and his vision. But the damage was done. The smiling faces on screen no longer told the whole story. A fracture had formed, one that would only grow with time. And as the dancers began to question their place on the show, another wave of change was coming. One even Cornelius couldn't control. The music itself was about to change. And with it, the entire identity of Soul Train. Music never stands still. And for a show built on rhythm and movement, change was inevitable. Throughout the 1970s and early 80s, Soul Train was untouchable, the gold standard of music television for Black America. But as the decades shifted, so did the sound. Funk gave way to early rap. Smooth R&B was replaced by hard-hitting hip-hop. The beats got heavier, the lyrics edgier, and the energy? It was raw, urgent, and entirely unfamiliar to Don Cornelius. Cornelius had built Soul Train on elegance, on polish and pride. He loved soul, adored R&B, and respected funk. But rap? That was something else. To him, hip-hop wasn't just new. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and at times, threatening. He once admitted that groups like Public Enemy actually frightened him. Their lyrics were aggressive, Their tone, confrontational. And their message? It didn't match the smooth, stylish vibe Cornelius had spent decades curating. Even in private conversations with artists like Curtis Blow, Cornelius expressed skepticism. He didn't understand the genre. He didn't trust it. And deep down, he wasn't sure it had a place on his train. But the world was changing. Fast. Hip-hop wasn't a fad. It was a force. From the Bronx to Compton, young black voices were using it to speak truths that other genres had danced around. They weren't just performing. They were protesting. And they were bringing millions of fans with them. Cornelius was caught in the middle. If he resisted, he risked becoming outdated. But if he embraced it too quickly, he feared losing the class and control that defined Soul Train. He tried to compromise. Rap acts were invited onto the show. LL Cool J, Run DMC, Salt and Pepper. But even then, you could sense the hesitation. Cornelius often looked uncomfortable introducing them. Some fans noticed, and some didn't like it. Longtime viewers, the ones who grew up with Al Green and the Emotions, began tuning out. The show they once loved felt unfamiliar, edgier, louder, different. At the same time, younger viewers found Soul Train slow and outdated compared to shows like Yo, MTV Raps, or Rap City. In trying to please everyone, Soul Train started pleasing no one. Rosie Perez, now choreographing and acting, later revealed another layer to the problem. She claimed Cornelius had no appreciation for East Coast dance styles. He saw them as too aggressive, too suggestive. The kind of raw, floor-pounding energy that drove hip-hop didn't fit his vision of clean, camera-ready dance. Still, he kept booking rap acts. Not because he loved the genre, but because he had to. The market demanded it. And that, perhaps, was the deepest wound. For over 2 decades, Don Cornelius had dictated what Soul Train looked and sounded like. But now, for the first time, he wasn't leading. He was reacting, compromising, and slowly losing grip on the show he once controlled with unshakable confidence. By the early 1990s, the conflict was undeniable. Soul Train no longer felt like his show. The music, the dancers, the audience, all had changed. And in 1993, Don Cornelius did something no one expected. He stepped off the train. After Don Cornelius stepped down in 1993, Soul Train kept rolling, but something had changed. The show brought in new hosts, comedian Maestro Clark, then Shamar Moore, and later Dorian Gregory. Each brought fresh energy, but none could fill the void Cornelius left. The show's signature calm, confident vibe was gone, and so was its sense of identity. Ratings began to slide, syndication deals weakened, stations pushed the show into late-night time slots, far from the Saturday morning ritual fans had grown up with. By the early 2000s, Soul Train's Nielsen ratings had dropped below 1.0, a shadow of its former glory. Behind the scenes, things got worse. Producers tried to salvage the brand with clip shows like The Best of Soul Train, recycling footage from the 70s and 80s. But instead of honoring its legacy, it felt like a slow fade-out. Then came the incident. A moment during taping that insiders still speak about in whispers. A clash between talent and production so intense, it never made it to air. Some claim it was a fight between dancers. Others say a performer went off script and caused chaos on stage. The details vary, but the aftermath was clear. The footage was locked away, never broadcast. According to staffers, it was the moment that forced producers to ask, "Is this still worth it?" It wasn't just a blooper. It was a breaking point, a visual symbol of a show that had lost its way. And once that moment passed, Soul Train never fully recovered. As Soul Train struggled on air, a new cultural wave was booming online, and Soul Train missed it completely. Fans hungry for nostalgia began uploading clips to YouTube. Legendary dance lines, unforgettable performances, and behind-the-scenes interviews. These uploads breathed new life into the show, introducing it to a younger generation who never saw it live. But Don Cornelius didn't see it as a revival. He saw it as a threat. He cracked down hard on copyright. Fan uploads were hit with takedowns. Bootleg DVDs were pulled. Cornelius believed the show's legacy needed to be protected, controlled, curated, and monetized properly. To him, unauthorized clips weren't tributes. They were violations. But the internet doesn't wait. While other classic shows embraced digital rebirths, Soul Train fell into obscurity. Fans couldn't legally find full episodes. New audiences couldn't discover its magic. And unlike the vinyl records and VHS tapes of the past, Soul Train had no digital footprint. In a world that moved at the speed of broadband, the show simply disappeared. The irony? A show that once revolutionized representation on TV had now become invisible in the digital age. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was locked away. By the early 1990s, Don Cornelius had spent more than 2 decades as the face, voice, and driving force behind Soul Train. But the landscape had changed, and so had he. In 1993, he stepped away from hosting the show, handing the spotlight to a rotation of younger celebrities. Cornelius stayed on as executive producer, but his presence on screen, that calm authority, that iconic voice, was gone, and the show began to drift. Without him, Soul Train struggled to find its rhythm. Ratings dropped, the format wobbled, and the cultural dominance it once held slipped into nostalgia. Cornelius, now behind the curtain, watched the train he built begin to lose steam. Behind the scenes, his personal life was unraveling too. His marriage had ended in a bitter divorce. Friends and colleagues said he had become withdrawn, more private, more guarded. Though he still appeared occasionally for tribute events and interviews, he seemed disconnected from the energy that once fueled him. In 2008, he sold the rights to Soul Train to Madvision Entertainment, a move many believed signaled that he was finally ready to let go. That same deal would later bring Soul Train to BET, relaunch the Soul Train Awards, and eventually lead to partnerships with Magic Johnson's Aspire TV and Paramount Global. But Cornelius wasn't part of that next chapter. On February 1, 2012, Don Cornelius was found dead in his Los Angeles home. Authorities ruled it a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 75. The news sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. Fans, celebrities, and former dancers flooded social media with tributes. Murals were painted. Dance parties broke out in city squares. Memorials echoed his famous sign-off: love, peace, and soul. But behind the sadness was a deeper reflection on the pressures of legacy, on what it costs to carry a movement for so long, and on how even the strongest-looking leaders can suffer in silence. Cornelius had changed television. He had changed culture. But in the end, it wasn't enough to save him from his own pain. His death was tragic. But his impact? Unforgettable. Don Cornelius left behind more than a show. He left behind a legacy of rhythm, representation, and pride. A reminder that even in the face of systemic barriers, one man's vision can shift the soul of a nation. Even after the show went off the air, Soul Train refused to fade away. Its spirit lived on, not just in old footage, but in fashion, in music, in the energy of Black creativity. In 2008, after Don Cornelius sold the rights, a new team took over, Madvision Entertainment. They didn't just want to preserve Soul Train, they wanted to reintroduce it to a new generation. And for the first time, the vault opened. So could a show like Soul Train exist today? Maybe. But it would need more than just music and dancers. It would need a mission, a message. The kind that Cornelius delivered every single Saturday. Love, peace,